Hi, this is Wahaba, and this is part of my Universal Worship primer. I think it's the fourth one, yeah, fourth video. And in this one, this video, I'm going to be talking about the process that I was taught and that I use to get to know the prophets or become familiar with what I call the feeling tone of each tradition. The feeling tone for me is something that is something that happens when you start to experience some essence of the tradition speaking through you. And each tradition has its own tone, its own feeling, and obviously it will be different for you than it is for me. And some of these feeling tones you'll be able to experience more intensely and more immediately than others. Some you have to work on a little bit. I do believe that it is possible to experience the feeling tone of any tradition, any religion that you encounter. I mean, I've experienced the feeling tone of Scientology, so, I have no issue with the idea that feeling tones exist in all belief systems. So the way that I was taught, and when I was first together in the little Shirag training group that I was in Kansas City, one of the things that we were all encouraged to do, we were all assigned traditions. And as part of those assignments, the first thing that we were queried about is there any tradition that you know the least about or are the least comfortable with? And of course, this is going to vary, of course, by individual. And I remember the tradition that I was the least familiar with at the time was Zoroastrianism, which is probably why that tradition has become one of the most important traditions that I work with. But for some people, Christianity was the tradition that they picked or were given because they were the least comfortable with it. Maybe they'd been raised with a certain aspect of it, had particularly negative experiences of it. So that's what I actually recommend. I don't recommend starting with the traditions that you're most familiar with. If you've been a Buddhist for, 20 years, don't start with Buddhism. Start with the ones that you don't know about or that kind of scare you a little bit. And what you're going to be doing is going through a system of training with them, as if you're going to allow this tradition to teach you about itself, rather than just simply going and learning about it. As part of this, you do need to learn the basic history of the tradition. And I'm a historian, so of course I'm going to recommend that. But to me, it's really useful to get the contexts, the cultural and historical context of a tradition. Because if you get that, you'll be able to understand what challenges that tradition faced, why it expressed itself that way, why that particular prophet at that particular time. And that all those things give you clues into what important essence about life that tradition is trying to convey. Because all traditions have at their core a root story. There's a central story. Now, I can tell you what those central roots are. But until you experience that root yourself, you're not going to fully get it. Like, for example, in the Jewish tradition, the root story is the story of Moses, particularly his experience first with the burning bush and then at Sinai. And it's understood in the Jewish tradition to be a communal experience. It's not just an experience he was having. It was an experience that the entire Jewish community had when God revealed itself through the 10 Commandments to Moses. So it's this moment when a nation is born. And that is a pivotal part of the story of Moses, that Moses being the interface between God and a group of people. That is the crux of his story, and going through that story and reading that and thinking about that, and also knowing how Jews have seen that over time, that's an important component of knowing what the feeling tone of Judaism is. Each tradition has that. Each tradition tries to address certain fundamental questions and issues about human existence. And a lot of times those questions are actually addressed in the central story. So in the central story for Jews, the question is always, who are we? How do we respond to this summons by the divine? How do we respond individually as a people? When the divine comes knocking on your door, what do you say? What do you do? So those are some of the fundamental questions that Judaism attempts to answer. This is even true of more modern traditions, say the Church of Latter-day Saints. I'll never forget the time when I suddenly realized what the feeling tone of the Church of Latter-day Saints was, when after having a series of experiences and watching a movie in Salt Lake City, I was attending a conference and I just decided to go and sort of check out, Tabernacle Square and a bunch of other places. And I ended up in a movie theater watching a movie about the origins of the Book of Mormon I was the only non-Mormon in the entire theater. And I suddenly realized what the feeling tone of the Latter-day Saints is about. It's about family. It's about making sure that you always have a family, making sure that you always have a community around you, and how important and vital that is. And that, of course, is a central organizing principle for the entire church. But it wasn't until I experienced that in that community, in that setting, that I got it. Prior to that, the Mormon Church had always been a complete and total mystery to me. So if you can figure that out, if you can experience that, that will explain what inspired the prophet to go on their quest for answers. Once you start getting that sense, and this isn't a visceral level, I experience it like in my body. Once you get it in your body, once you feel it, you will be better able to understand how to express and facilitate the experience of that tradition to other people through the universal worship service. It's almost as if you go from tradition to tradition and those traditions speak through you for a moment. It's a very important thing to be able to experience and to be able to share. I always recommend that you live with the tradition for at least a month. Do some of the prayers or meditations of that tradition. Try to live in the skin of a believer or a practitioner for at least a month. Every day. So if you're doing Zoroastrianism, every day do the Hashem Vahu. Hashem Vahu Vahishtam Asti Ushta Mahiata Shai Vishtai Hashem. Do that 3 times every day as part of your practice. Come to know what that means. Come to know what the cadence of that is. And where it fits into the worship service, their meditation service. And it'll start transmitting to you. The prophet will start transmitting to you, and you'll start to get that feeling tone. Also, if possible, try to connect with actual members of that tradition's community. Now, this is something that I learned from having a master's degree in religious studies, and we were required to go and do this for some of my seminars that I took as a graduate student. But I have found it to be invaluable, and when I have taught comparative religion at the college level, I require my students to do stuff like this, to connect with actual members of a tradition's community, or if there are several versions or iterations or denominations of that tradition available, find out what the different approaches are about and entail. Seek people out who are members of these communities and actually talk to them about their experiences. I mean, one of the most profound experiences I've ever had, even as an academic or as a person, was the personal conversation that I had the opportunity to have with David Koresh's mother on the anniversary of the destruction of the Waco community, the Branch Davidian Waco community. She was talking about the loss of a son and her grandchildren. And since she was a Branch Davidian, what that meant for her personally. It was a very powerful moment, regardless of what you think about David Koresh, regardless of what you think about the Branch Davidians or the Seventh-day Adventists. Makes no difference. Here's a woman talking about her faith in the context of a very personal, prophetic moment for her son. Knowing people, getting to understand where people come from in their tradition is a vital, vital component of what it means to be able to adequately transmit the essence, the prophetic essence of these traditions within a ritual context. To me, the universal worship service doesn't even work unless you can do that, which may be why it doesn't work for a lot of people a lot of the time. So these are the things that I recommend in getting to know the feeling tone of a tradition. Now, if I can get this thing to stop here. And just as a final example, I've talked a little bit about the Zoroastrianism and the issues with indigenous traditions. And one of the things I would like to point out about Zoroastrianism is that it's rare that when I have attended a universal worship that I have seen the individuals doing Zoroastrianism to be able to really adequately express the complexity of this tradition. And there's so many possibilities there. If you're interested in doing something with nature, it's all there in the Zoroastrian tradition. On the left, we see the 7 Amesha Spenta, the 7 immortal holies of the Zoroastrian tradition. And of these, of course, there's Ahura Mazda, which most people focus on. But of these, we have Ashavahishta, who is the embodiment of fire. We have Spenta Armaiti and Harvatat, who are representations of, not just representations, but embodiments of water and of earth and of the plants and of animals. Like Vohumana is the guardian of all the animals. So there are some very visceral, amazing things that you can do with Zoroastrianism. You wouldn't have to stick with just Ahura Mazda. If you wanted to do something about water, for example, you could talk about not only the Amesha Spenta that embodies water, but of course Anahita, who is the Yazata who inspired Zarathustra and showed him the Amesha Spenta. If you contrast that with, for example, what's on the right, this is one of the cosmologies and the medicine wheels of the Shawnee Nation here in the United States. And this is a very specific medicine wheel that is peculiar to them. And the only way in which you would be able to actually share components of this in a worship service is if you knew about it, had been initiated into it, and could directly link components of it to the more universal aspects of the worship service as a whole. You could do some of the direction stuff, but you would have to specifically know how to connect that. It's a much more complicated process. It's not impossible, but again, you would have to get permission of the community in order to do it. The reason why you don't have to get permission from the Zoroastrians is that they understand their tradition as a universal tradition. In other words, the prophecy that Zoroaster had is a prophecy that is true always, for all time, for all people, whether or not you accept it. That's what makes it a universal religion versus, say, the Shawnee cosmology, where it really only applies not only to the Shawnee, but to a particular branch of the Shawnee, you see. And that's the difference between them. They're not all, exactly equivalent and usable. In essence, it's the difference between simply reporting on a tradition and facilitating an experience of it and with it to others. That's what the feeling tone is all about.